This work is not about the Wuchang Uprising as a moment in revolutionary history. It is about what that moment reveals. How authoritarian regimes collapse, not when they lose power, but when they lose the capacity to adapt under pressure. The uprising of October 10, 1911, did not occur because a single garrison revolted, or because one set of ideas triumphed over another. It occurred because the Qing dynasty had exhausted its legitimacy, and because its attempts to preserve control had systematically dismantled its ability to renew it. The lessons of Wuchang are not confined to the past. They matter now because the structural conditions that made the uprising decisive, external pressure, internal fragmentation, political bottlenecks, and ideological drift, are once again converging in the present. The contemporary Chinese regime operates in a vastly different context, with far greater administrative capacity and coercive reach. But it is facing a version of the same trap. The transformation of manageable constraint into existential risk, triggered not by opposition alone, but by the regime's refusal to share authority in order to survive it. This is not a prediction of collapse. It is a warning about systems that lose the ability to adjust. The Qing fell not because it lacked ideas, strength, or even reform. It fell because it treated consent as expendable. At every moment when trust could have been rebuilt, through political inclusion, fiscal transparency, or ideological pluralism, it chose containment. That containment delayed rupture, but also guaranteed it. The central claim of this work is that pressure does not become revolutionary by itself. It becomes revolutionary when regimes attempt to absorb it through coercion, denial, and performance, rather than through participation, transparency, and shared adjustment. The more legitimacy is tied to control, the more brittle it becomes. The more dissent is framed as disloyalty, the faster political imagination moves underground. And when belief in a shared future collapses, revolution becomes thinkable before it becomes inevitable. We examine the Qing not as a failed tradition, but as a complete case, a regime that governed a vast, complex society through reform, repression, and narrative discipline, yet never permitted its population to become stakeholders in adaptation. Each effort at survival, military modernization, educational overhaul, administrative reform, collapsed into crisis because it excluded consent at the foundation. This is the lesson authoritarian systems have yet to learn. Surveillance, discipline, and narrative control can delay reckoning. They cannot prevent it. Pressure that cannot be spoken is not dissolved, it is displaced into cynicism, elite disengagement, social withdrawal, and quiet ideological drift, until it returns with less warning and fewer peaceful exits. The Wuchang Uprising succeeded not because it was powerful, but because the Qing had already ceased to represent the future in the minds of its soldiers, officials, and citizens. The question facing the current regime is whether it can remain in command of China's future without trusting its population to help define it. That question remains open, but Wuchang offers a clear answer to what happens when it is asked too late. External pressure does not destroy regimes by itself. It becomes existential only when a political system lacks mechanisms for absorbing constraint without converting it into a crisis of legitimacy. The Qing dynasty did not collapse because it faced imperialist powers. It collapsed because external pressure repeatedly exposed limits that the regime could neither acknowledge openly nor renegotiate collectively with its population. Each exposure, therefore, translated into a loss of authority, and each loss of authority narrowed the regime's options until violence became the only remaining outlet for political change. From the Opium Wars through the Boxer Rebellion, the Qing experienced a sequence of confrontations that revealed the same underlying problem in different forms. Militarily, technologically, and fiscally, the dynasty was no longer capable of defending China within the emerging global order. These defeats mattered, not simply because territory was lost or indemnities imposed, but because they demonstrated that the ruling system could no longer guarantee protection. In a political order where legitimacy rested on the ruler's capacity to maintain sovereignty and stability, failure at defense could not be compartmentalized. It called the entire basis of authority into question. The unequal treaties institutionalized this exposure. They did not merely constrain policy, they made constraint visible and permanent. Extraterritoriality, concessions and indemnities publicly signaled that the dynasty governed only by permission of stronger powers. Crucially, the Qing had no consent-based mechanism to process this reality. The population was not asked to participate in redefining national priorities, sharing sacrifices, or adjusting expectations. Constraint was experienced as humiliation imposed from above and from outside, with no channel for collective ownership. This is the point at which external pressure became politically fatal. Because the dynasty could not admit limits without undermining itself, it oscillated between denial and repression. Each foreign defeat therefore produced not reform grounded in consent, but intensified rigidity. As a result, loyalty to the Qing came to be interpreted as acceptance of national weakness. Revolutionary movements did not need to invent opposition. External pressure supplied the proof that the existing system was no longer viable. The contemporary Chinese regime now stands at an early but unmistakable stage of the same structural trap. The form of external pressure is different, but its political function is strikingly similar. Today's challenge is not territorial dismemberment or treaty ports, but externally imposed constraints that define the upper bounds of development. Technology controls, supply chain realignments, financial exposure, and alliance coordination do not eliminate growth, but they reveal where growth depends on ecosystems beyond the regime's unilateral control. This is bounded modernization. Progress continues, but under ceilings shaped by strategic rivalry rather than domestic choice. Each time a new choke point is exposed, the same political question arises. Can the regime acknowledge limits without forfeiting legitimacy? At present, the answer is no. The ruling system has bound its legitimacy to uninterrupted assent and sovereign self-sufficiency. As a result, every externally revealed constraint becomes politically radioactive. Instead of being treated as a shared national challenge requiring collective adaptation, it is framed as an existential threat demanding discipline, unity, and silence. The population is asked to endure pressure, but not to participate in redefining success or shaping trade-offs. This response recreates the Qing's fatal logic in modern form. External constraint produces exposure. Exposure heightens the symbolic stakes of performance. Heightened stakes lead the regime to suppress discussion and double down on control. Control, in turn, prevents the emergence of consent-based adjustment, ensuring that the next exposure is even more destabilizing. The danger here is not immediate collapse, it is cumulative brittleness. When legitimacy depends on denying limits, the system cannot learn openly. When citizens are treated as subjects to be managed rather than participants in national adaptation, pressure does not dissipate, it migrates. It reappears as cynicism, withdrawal, risk aversion, quiet non-compliance, or elite paralysis. These are not signs of stability. They are the preconditions of sudden rupture. The Qing did not fall because imperialism was overwhelming. It fell because it never created a political framework in which loss, delay, or compromise could be collectively owned. Every constraint therefore delegitimized the system further, until revolution appeared as the only remaining path to national renewal. The same outcome is not inevitable today, but it is entirely possible if the current trajectory continues. The alternative is not denial of rivalry or retreat from ambition, it is a consent-based reconfiguration of legitimacy. That means openly acknowledging constraints, involving society in setting priorities, sharing burdens transparently, and allowing disagreement without treating it as disloyalty. Legitimacy must be grounded not in infallibility, but in participation. External pressure does not have to produce revolution. It produces revolution only when a regime insists on absorbing constraint through coercion rather than consent. The lesson of the Qing is not that foreign pressure destroys states. It is that states destroy themselves when they refuse to trust their own societies with the truth of their situation. A regime does not usually fall when it is merely pressured. It falls when everyday governance stops functioning as a credible exchange between ruler and ruled, and when the population can no longer see lawful adjustment as possible. The Qing experience shows that internal instability becomes existential when fiscal strain, social volatility, and identity conflict combine to destroy trust faster than the state can restore it. The point of revisiting that pattern is not to explain 1911. It is to show that the present Chinese regime is moving into a comparable danger zone, and that the only non-violent exit is to rebuild legitimacy through consent inside the system before disaffection hardens into revolutionary possibility. The Qing's internal crisis began with a simple but fatal problem. The center claimed responsibility for national survival, but it could not reliably command the resources required to carry that responsibility. Foreign indemnities, military modernization costs, and administrative decay strained revenue. But the deeper issue was that the fiscal system depended on local intermediaries who controlled collection and remittance. When pressure rose, provincial officials and regional commanders did what systems always do under misaligned incentives. They protected themselves first. They delayed remittances, diverted funds, and treated imperial directives as negotiable. The court could still speak, but it could not ensure execution. Authority became a performance rather than a capability. The path out of that trap would have required something the Qing did not build. A consent-based fiscal relationship, meaning transparent burdens, shared sacrifice, and institutions through which localities and social elites could participate in setting priorities rather than merely absorbing demands. Without that, the center responded with moralizing, coercion, and improvisation, which made local evasion more rational and further reduced truthful feedback. In other words, the state treated compliance as something to be forced, not something to be earned through credible coordination. That choice did not merely fail to solve the problem, it trained the system to simulate obedience while hollowing governance. That same pattern now threatens the contemporary Chinese regime, not because the state is weak, but because its local state model has become structurally cornered. The center demands employment, stability, and growth while constraining political risk and controlling key levers. But local governments carry the daily burden of delivery with stressed balance sheets and shrinking revenue bases. When property-linked finance breaks down and debt overhang rises, localities are pushed into survival governance. They preserve appearances, meet targets on paper, delay costs, and shift risk into opaque vehicles. This is not rebellion. It is the modern form of Qing-era under-remittance and selective compliance. The existential danger is that once a system learns to perform compliance, it loses the information needed to correct itself. The first consent-based intervention here is not rhetorical openness. It is institutional honesty. Fiscal transparency, credible restructuring mechanisms, and a negotiated realignment of responsibilities between center and locality are not good governance luxuries. They are the price of preventing the state from drifting into governance by simulation, which is the substrate on which sudden political rupture forms. In the Qing case, fiscal fragility quickly became social volatility because relief failed where suffering was concentrated. Floods, droughts, crop failures, and tax pressure produced recurrent unrest, and the state's inability to respond convinced communities that official authority did not protect them. When people stop expecting the state to deliver relief, they stop treating the state as legitimate. The vacuum is then filled by alternative structures that provide belonging, mutual aid, and moral narrative. Secret societies mattered less because they were conspiratorial than because they were present where the state was absent. They became the channels through which grievance could be organized and then politicized. The contemporary analog is not secret societies. It is the combination of precarity and networked consciousness. Youth job insecurity, household balance sheet stress, and blocked upward mobility generate the same political chemistry as late Qing rural crisis. A large population that feels the system cannot or will not deliver the promised future. The crucial difference is organizational form, not political effect. Disaffection today often appears first as withdrawal, reduced consumption, delayed life plans, disengagement from official narratives, exit through emigration or inward retreat. That quietness is not reassuring. It is an early stage of legitimacy loss in which people stop investing in the system because they do not believe they can shape outcomes through lawful channels. The consent-based intervention at this stage is to stop treating confidence as propaganda and start treating it as a contract. If citizens only ever encounter policy as command, censorship, and these sudden swings, they end up learning that truth is unsafe and participation is meaningless. But if the system creates credible ways for people to register costs, influence priorities, and see burdens shared rather than just imposed, then social volatility doesn't need to find some external container. It can actually be metabolized internally. That, though, requires some pretty concrete shifts, like reliable social protection that doesn't depend on local fiscal theatre, visible mechanisms for correcting policy errors without punishing candor, and space for civic input that isn't automatically seen as hostility. The Qing dynasty failed at this point because it treated unrest as deviance to suppress, rather than as information to integrate. And the modern regime risks repeating that same error if it treats every expression of distress as a security threat, rather than as feedback about governability. In the Qing collapse, ethnicity became politically catalytic only after governance had already failed. For long periods, Manchu rule did not automatically produce rebellion. Identity became explosive when the dynasty's failures made outsider rule a persuasive explanation for why suffering was unmanaged and humiliation endured. Ethnic distinction became a moral shorthand for illegitimacy. Once that shift happens, it is extremely difficult to reverse because people are no longer arguing about policy competence. They are arguing about whether the ruler belongs. The modern regime faces the same hazard mechanism in different clothing. When minority regions are governed through coercion, surveillance, and forced assimilation, the state may suppress open resistance, but it also teaches a broader lesson: that governance is something done to people, not with them. Under economic strain, that lesson becomes portable. It migrates from the periphery into the national imagination, where identity issues become symbolic evidence of a deeper moral failure. The consent-based alternative is not weakness, it is durability. Cultural security, meaningful local voice, and transparent legal standards reduce the chance that identity becomes the language through which national legitimacy is attacked. The Qing could not do this because it was structurally allergic to power sharing. A modern regime that refuses consent-based inclusion will discover that coercion buys silence but sells legitimacy. This is the central warning. Internal instability becomes existential when the state substitutes coercion and performance management for trust and participation. Fiscal strain pushes localities towards simulation, and simulation destroys truthful feedback. That loss of feedback leads to policy error and incoherence. Incoherence in turn erodes confidence, and confidence erosion just worsens fiscal strain. Social withdrawal deepens, and identity grievances become moral accelerants. At that point, the system may look stable, but it's actually brittle. A state with high control and low trust, where non-violent adjustment feels impossible. That is the pre-revolutionary condition, and it's exactly what a consent-based approach is meant to prevent. The alternative, then, has to be present at every step, not just tacked on at the end. The goal isn't to persuade the population to endure pressure in silence. The goal is to create institutions and habits through which pressure can be shared, debated, and absorbed, without delegitimizing the regime itself. The Qing collapsed when it could no longer turn authority into governance, and governance into trust. Any modern regime that repeats that sequence isn't managing instability. It's manufacturing the conditions under which violent rupture eventually becomes the only imaginable form of change. Regimes do not usually fall because they lose authority. They fall because authority becomes unable to learn without undermining itself. The late Qing dynasty illustrates this danger with unusual clarity, and it does so in a way that speaks directly to the present. Political paralysis emerges when a system treats power sharing as a threat rather than a resource, and when reform is managed as a display of control rather than as a process of collective adjustment. Under those conditions, authority survives in form but fails in function, and violent rupture becomes more likely precisely because peaceful correction is foreclosed. The late Qing crisis did not begin with stagnation. It began with reform. After the Boxer Rebellion, the court recognized that the existing order was no longer viable and launched the new policies. Military modernization, educational overhaul, administrative restructuring, and promises of constitutional government all signaled awareness that survival required change. These initiatives mattered because they raised expectations among reform-minded elites and local leaders who believed that China could modernize without violent rupture if authority became more accountable and participatory. The fatal mistake was that reform was never allowed to redistribute decision-making power. Deliberative institutions were created, but they were denied real authority. Constitutional timelines were announced, then postponed. Participation was invited, but only on terms that preserved absolute central control. Reform was presented as a gift from above rather than a negotiation with society. The result was not gradual stabilization, but accelerated delegitimation. Reformists concluded that the system could not be trusted to change itself. Moderates lost credibility. Revolutionaries gained it. The political center collapsed not because reform went too far, but because it went nowhere meaningful. At every step, there was an alternative path that the Qing refused to take. A consent-based approach would have treated reform not as a concession that endangered authority, but as a mechanism for renewing it. Sharing decision-making power, even partially, would have allowed the regime to convert reformist energy into institutional loyalty. Protected debate would have transformed delay into deliberation rather than betrayal. The dynasty collapsed because it feared loss of control more than loss of legitimacy. The contemporary Chinese regime now faces the same structural risk from the opposite direction. Instead of promising political pluralism and withholding it, the system has explicitly narrowed political expectations while consolidating authority. The removal of presidential term limits and the tightening of vertical control were justified as safeguards against instability, factionalism, and drift. The underlying logic is clear. Coherence and discipline are treated as prerequisites for survival in a hostile environment. This logic becomes dangerous when it turns authority into a bottleneck. By concentrating power to prevent disorder, the system makes its own capacity to adapt, dependent on the quality of internal feedback. Yet the same consolidation systematically degrades that feedback. Cadres, technocrats, and institutional intermediaries remain embedded and loyal, but they learn quickly that survival depends on alignment rather than candor. Problems are reframed to fit approved narratives. Failures are concealed or deferred. Innovation is permitted only when success is guaranteed. This is not sabotage, it's actually rational behavior in a control-heavy system. But its effect is corrosive. When truthful reporting becomes risky, the center loses the information it needs to govern a complex society. Policy errors just persist longer. Corrections arrive later and at a much higher cost. The system grows quieter, but that quiet reflects fear, not health. Here again, the consent-based alternative must operate inside the process, not after breakdown. A system that wants to avoid violent rupture must create protected channels where disagreement, warning, and failure can surface without being treated as a political threat. This isn't liberalization for its own sake. It's actually an operational necessity. Without institutionalized candor, authority just becomes blind. Without shared ownership of reform, every correction looks like retreat. The late Qing experienced this blindness acutely. Provincial assemblies, created without real power, became theaters of frustration rather than cooperation. Officials spoke, but nothing really changed. The modern analog is governance by metrics and slogans, where compliance is demonstrated on paper, while underlying problems just deepen. In both cases, authority is maintained through appearance, but learning is suppressed. When crisis arrives, the system must either overreact or freeze, because it has lost the capacity for calibrated response. Overreaction and delay are not opposites. They're actually twin products of the same paralysis. When admission of error threatens authority, the state either clamps down hard to suppress symptoms or just waits, hoping conditions improve. Both choices reinforce centralization, further narrowing the space for adjustment. Each crisis response becomes evidence that tighter control is necessary, even as that control makes the next crisis harder to manage. A consent-based path would interrupt this loop early. It would redefine loyalty not as silence, but as participation in problem solving. It would reward officials for accuracy rather than performance theatre. It would normalize policy reversal as competence rather than weakness. Most critically, it would restore confidence among elites and intermediaries that the system has a future beyond any single leader or campaign. Credible rotation, institutional continuity, and shared authority aren't threats to stability. They're actually its preconditions. The existential danger is not that the current regime lacks strength. It's that strength without adaptability becomes brittle. When authority cannot learn, it must enforce. When it cannot persuade, it must compel. Over time, this converts reform into a dead end and control into a trap. The Qing reached that point too late to recover. The warning here is that modern regimes reach it more quietly and therefore more dangerously. Political paralysis doesn't announce itself as a crisis. Instead, it shows up as discipline, unity, and resolve. The true cost, though, is paid later, when peaceful correction no longer feels possible, and when pressure, long contained, seeks release through rupture. So the only reliable way to prevent that outcome is to rebuild consent inside authority now, while adjustment is still possible, and before violence becomes thinkable again. States fall when they can no longer persuade people that the future still runs through them. The Qing didn't collapse because its enemies were stronger. It collapsed because its vision of China just stopped being credible. Once the dynasty could no longer monopolize meaning, every act of control became less stabilizing. The future, in a sense, detached from the throne before the army ever did. Today, the Chinese Communist Party governs in a totally different information environment, but it's facing a familiar structural risk. Not open ideological revolt, but the unraveling of narrative legitimacy. It's slow, ambient, and increasingly difficult to reverse. The Qing lost its hold over the future when competing visions flooded in: republicanism, nationalism, socialism, and anarchism, carried by students, merchants, military officers, and exiles. These weren't just critiques of Qing policy, they were full-fledged reimaginings of China. Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles became a rallying point, not because they were perfectly defined, but because they offered a clear alternative: loyalty to the nation, not the dynasty; political participation, not hereditary rule; livelihood as a political, not merely economic concern. The Qing's Confucian order, once hegemonic, was suddenly just one option among many, and not a very persuasive one. But ideas alone didn't bring down the dynasty. The collapse came when belief in the monarchy's exclusive claim to represent China disintegrated across multiple layers of society: elites, officials, soldiers. The new army defected not just because it was modern, but because it was politically orphaned. The Qing had trained new officers but offered them no credible future to serve. Revolutionary pamphlets didn't need to win arguments in isolation. They needed only to spread faster than trust in the court could be repaired. This is the threshold that regimes cross when the imagination of the future escapes the architecture of power. What mattered most wasn't that new ideas existed, but that the old ones could no longer contain hope. The current Chinese regime does not face ideological opposition in the Qing sense. There is no unified counter-movement, no revolutionary blueprint. What it faces is more subtle and potentially more corrosive: a pluralization of meaning under the surface of stability. Alternative ways of imagining purpose and belonging now circulate everywhere, digitally, culturally, informally. They rarely claim to overthrow the state. Instead, they express themselves through coded withdrawal, sideways satire, local identity, quiet subcultures, or moral critique disguised as lifestyle. Technocratic meritocracy, civilizational nationalism, Maoist revivalism, liberal constitutionalism, religious moral community, retreat from ambition, what some call lying flat, and strategic disengagement, or let it rot, are not part of any single coordinated ideology. But together, they mark the slow diffusion of loyalty away from official doctrine. None of these outlooks is powerful enough alone to produce revolution. but their shared consequence is that the state's narrative monopoly erodes even as its material power endures. The state's instinct is to treat this drift as a messaging problem to be corrected by narrative discipline. But narrative control is not legitimacy. You can censor the words, but not the loss of belief. The more the regime suppresses alternative meaning-making, the more those meanings fragment, mutate, and circulate in harder-to-detect forms. What emerges is not one rival ideology, but 1,000 quiet defections from shared belief. This is not ideological collapse in the open. It is slow ideological hollowing. People obey, but they no longer believe that obedience connects to a future they recognize as their own. The system thus begins to operate in a feedback loop that makes it harder to break free. The more dissent is suppressed, the more dissent reappears in dispersed, informal, ironic, or mimetic forms. The more alternative meaning circulates, the more the state depends on coercion to enforce its central narrative. The more coercion is required to uphold the narrative, the less the narrative persuades. This is what ideological fragmentation looks like inside a system that prioritizes control over consent. It does not require formal opposition. It simply requires that a regime's future no longer feel believable to the people it governs. The late Qing could not recognize this loss in time. By the time it tolerated ideological debate, it had already lost the moral center of gravity. Even soldiers with rifles saw the dynasty as irrelevant to the country they believed in. Revolution did not come from a place of confidence, but from a vacuum of belief. The modern regime is not there yet, but it is moving in that direction unless it intervenes at the level of consent. Not just behavior, but imagination. The future cannot be commanded, it must be co-owned. That means allowing people to articulate divergent visions without treating divergence as disloyalty. It means building institutions where disagreement is a sign of civic engagement, not of sedition. It means accepting that narrative unity enforced through fear is no unity at all. It is a countdown. The consent-based path does not require ideological uniformity. It requires political space wide enough to contain difference without splitting apart. It requires treating loyalty not as agreement with every premise, but as shared investment in a system that can adapt and endure. It requires giving people the right to speak about the future without being punished for imagining it differently. The lesson from the Qing is not that ideological fragmentation causes collapse. It's that when imagination detaches from authority, collapse becomes possible. And when imagination is punished rather than integrated, collapse becomes likely. China today is not the Qing. It is stronger, richer, and more capable by every metric of state power. But its greatest danger is not collapse through invasion or rebellion. It is sclerosis. The narrowing of options that comes when every signal of weakness is treated as threat, and every source of feedback as disloyalty. Pressure builds, economic, social, geopolitical, and the state responds with control. But control, without a mechanism of consent, does not dissolve pressure. It only traps it. And when that pressure finally forces release, the rupture is less a revolution than a structural failure, a system no longer able to learn in time. Whether there will be another Wuchang depends not on opposition strength or timing, but on whether the current system can create lawful, credible, and participatory ways to navigate constraint before desperation makes risk feel like the only path forward. Consent is not a luxury for calm times. It is the architecture that makes adaptation under stress possible. The Qing lacked that architecture. It left no space between loyalty and collapse. If today's regime repeats that design, the name of the next uprising may differ. Its structure will not. Or will it try to seal it off? If it chooses the latter, it may preserve silence, but it will lose belief. And when the time comes that belief is needed to survive a crisis, it will not be there. Consent is not a concession. It is the only durable form of legitimacy in a society where the future can no longer be dictated from above. If history offers warnings rather than repetitions, Wuchang is less a past event than a structural omen. The uprising that began on October 10, 1911, did not succeed because it was overwhelming. It succeeded because the Qing regime had already lost the ability to contain pressure without shattering. Its fall began not with revolutionaries seizing ground, but with a state that, over years, had forfeited the capacity to adapt, to share risk, to hear dissent. Wuchang was not a lightning strike in a clear sky. It was the final spark in a landscape already smoldering. By the time guns fired, faith in reform had been spent, belief in recovery had evaporated, and the empire's defenses were moral, not material, already gone. This is what makes Wuchang matter now, not as a prophecy, but as a mirror. The most serious political dangers do not arise from protest movements or ideological ferment alone. They arise when pressure, long displaced, has nowhere left to go. When a regime governs through silence, coaxing it from subordinates, enforcing it in media, expecting it from citizens. It may preserve order, but only by turning politics into performance and dissent into exile. Over time, that silence thickens. Officials stop warning, elites hedge privately, citizens pull back their investment in the future. A regime may appear unchallenged, even confident, while beneath the surface it loses the very tissue that allows it to bend without breaking. China today is not the Qing. It is stronger, richer, and more capable by every metric of state power. But its greatest danger is not collapse through invasion or rebellion. It is sclerosis, the narrowing of options that comes when every signal of weakness is treated as threat and every source of feedback as disloyalty. Pressure builds, economic, social, geopolitical, and the state responds with control. But control, without a mechanism of consent, does not dissolve pressure. It only traps it. And when that pressure finally forces release, the rupture is less a revolution than a structural failure. A system no longer able to learn in time. Whether there will be another Wuchang depends not on opposition strength or timing, but on whether the current system can create lawful, credible, and participatory ways to navigate constraint before desperation makes risk feel like the only path forward. Consent is not a luxury for calm times. It is the architecture that makes adaptation under stress possible. The Qing lacked that architecture. It left no space between loyalty and collapse. If today's regime repeats that design, the name of the next uprising may differ. Its structure will not.